In this video, we're going to be talking about constraints. This is a theme that will be recurring throughout the entire semester. So usually what we'll do is we'll look at some trend in development, and then we will evaluate different constraints that affect that trend or affect different age groups. So the definition of constraints is characteristics of the individual environment or task that limit or discourage certain movements or permit or encourage other movements. Okay, so usually when students see the word constraint, they think of the root constrain. And typically when we use that in our English language, it has more of a negative connotation, in the sense like, oh, I'm constraining somebody, or you're preventing them from doing something. Okay. In our class, constraints are just like boundaries, if you want to think about it that way. So if you think of a body of water like a river, okay, you have river banks on two sides because that defines the river, right? So in a sense, the river banks on each side limit where water can travel, but they also permit where water can travel based on how the land bends. Okay, so constraints both limit and permit movement. So they're not bad. In our class, when we talk about constraints, we're primarily going to be using NEWELL'S constraints model, which is part of an ecological perspective. So it's largely tied to how an individual works in the environment. And particularly, we're going to be emphasizing the dynamic interactions between the characteristics of constraints being related to the individual, the environment, as well as the task. Okay, so this is going to be our primary method of analyzing our developmental stages, and it will help us to look at developmental factors that affect movement. It could help us create developmentally appropriate tasks and environments. So if you consider how you're teaching a motor skill to a certain age group, right, you might constrain certain factors in teaching that motor skill in order to have a nice sequential skill progression for that learner. We also use this model to understand individual movers from an observational standpoint. So a lot of our activities in this class are observation-based, where you watch a video of someone who's been told, like, oh, throw a ball. And then you kind of look at, all right, what are some things that are either limiting or permitting how they are moving in their given environment. Okay. So when you think of NEWELL'S constraints model, you're thinking of kind of like the recycle image. And we have a triangle with our three characteristics of constraints: our individual constraints, our environmental constraints, and our task constraints. So if you look at the example of walking, and we'll get into each of these constraints a little bit more in depth, but let's say we have a person who is walking. When we think about that activity, if we're considering the individual, we have to say, who are they and at what stage of the lifespan are they in, right? Because a toddler would walk very differently from an adolescent, who would walk very differently from an older adult. Okay, so in that example, age could be an individual constraint, or it could be a factor playing into individual constraints that are either structural or functional. If we consider the environment, what surface is the person walking on, right? And then different components within the environment might be constraining movement. So if someone's walking on dry land versus icy sidewalks, which I have to deal with in Massachusetts now, not falling while walking is a lot more of a conscious thought process now, right? But ice would be an environmental constraint because it affects my step length, right? I tend to take smaller steps, and I tend to not walk so much heel to toe, but more stumpy, okay? So ice would be an environmental constraint that changes or affects how I move. We also have to look at the task being completed, right? So are there certain things that I am required to do while walking, such as talking on a phone? Or am I walking around people? Am I walking around or through obstacles? Okay, so different task components or different definitions of the task or modifications or adaptations could also constrain how a person moves within their environment, or they also interact with the individual themselves. So if we break each of these down, we'll give some more specific examples. Individual constraints are going to largely be related to a person's physical and mental characteristics. So these are internal to the person. Think inside the body. Different types of individual constraints. The first type is structural. So this is related to the body structure. Right? I use this picture of Kevin Hart and Shaquille O'Neal because it's funny for one, but also height is a constraint, right? So if we have a toddler, let's say, and they're trying to reach for a cookie on the counter, right? Let's say that the counter height is taller than said toddler. So in that respect, height would be a constraint that limits the ability of that toddler to reach the cookie. Now, if we had an adolescent or a young adult who has greater height, that height is now a constraint that permits them to reach said cookie. Okay? So these are structural characteristics that limit or permit a person to do a certain type of movement. Other examples that we have here are weight, limb length. Okay, those are kind of the more obvious like structural characteristics. But these structural constraints tend to change slowly over time. While there might be greater rates of change like earlier in the lifespan, like from infancy to childhood and then from adolescence to young adulthood, when we look at the lifespan as a whole, there really isn't huge amounts of change at one time. Okay, so tend to change slowly over time. The other type of individual constraint is a functional constraint, and these are related to behavioral function. So think more mental and psychological type constraints or factors. So we can think motivation, if somebody has attention, right, or if an attention span period, but how they focus and allocate that attention within their environment or within their task components. This could also be a person's level of experience doing something. And these tend to change more rapidly over time. Okay, so I put this little determined baby as an example of motivation, but individual constraints, internal, related to the individual. They can be structural, which is related to their body, right, or their vesicle that they're working with, or they could be functional, which is more of the mental characteristics. The next type of constraint that we talk about in this class are environmental. So environment, think external to the body or outside of the body. And these are constraints that are related to the properties of the world around us. Okay, so these are one distinction to make. Environmental constraints are global and they're not task specific. So both environmental and task constraints are external to the person. Okay, so global, think whatever's in the environment that's not specific to the specific task a person's performing. And you guys will get some more practice with these because I think the environmental and the task constraints are sometimes a little bit more difficult to grasp onto. But we do have different types of environmental constraints. We could have physical, such as, think like physical. So temperature could be a type of environmental constraint, right? If I'm running a mile, I might be more inclined to run a faster mile time in kind of moderate temperatures versus extreme hot or extreme cold. Okay. Gravity is another environmental constraint that has very good and significant interactions with individual constraints, especially in infancy, right? Because our ability to resist gravity is a muscular strength component, right? So that's one example of how individual and environmental constraints will interact with each other, but gravity is an environmental constraint. Different types of surfaces are also environmental constraints. That was the example I gave with the ice and walking, okay? We also have sociocultural environmental constraints, and these are more related to gender roles or cultural norms that society defines for us. Well, they're generalized definitions, I suppose. So I put like the women's soccer team and gender roles a bit as an example of like females in sports. Okay. Other examples that we'll end up coming up with later in the semester are different tasks and activities that children might engage with based on their gender, right? So usually we put females in dance class and we put boys in football, right? So these are different types of constraints that are going to limit or permit the types of activities or movements a person might do. The last type of constraint that we have are task constraints, again, external to the body, so they're not a part of the individual. But task constraints are specifically related to the goals of a movement or an activity. So if you guys have taken Kin 312 before this class, or you're taking it concurrently with this class, when we talk about an action goal, it is like a defined set of sequences. It's a defined sequence of events. And there's certain characteristics that make up that action goal. But when we look at task constraints, we're considering that specific action goal. We're considering different rules or codes of conduct that are guiding the task performance. And we're also including relevant equipment. Okay. So I have this example of basketball and driving. Okay. So let's say we're driving down a highway. Part of the task constraint, right, is to stay in your lane. Okay. So sometimes people might think, or people get confused between task and environmental because both of them are external. But if you're driving from home to work, let's use that example, right? The specific route you take is a task constraint. Okay. Lights changing in the environment, those would be environmental constraints, right? A green light permits you to go, red light limits you or makes you stop. Okay. In the basketball example, right, certain court maneuvers that are a part of a specific play, those would be task constraints because they basically influence how you are moving on the court. Crowd noise, that would be more of an environmental constraint. Okay, if someone's shooting a free throw and like people are yelling and screaming out in the crowd, right, that's not specifically related to the task itself of shooting a basket or a free throw. Okay. I hate to say this, but sometimes more information is needed. So in the examples I give you guys in class, a lot of times I try to be as specific as possible, especially if I'm asking you to I specifically identify task versus environmental. But sometimes classifications can be more fluid. Okay, so like the red light, green light scenario. You could view that as both a task and environmental constraint. If the action goal was like, oh, you are driving to a stoplight and you are going to stop, okay, that is more of a task constraint because it's a rule of the road directly affects how you complete that task of driving up to a stoplight and stopping. But if you're just driving, and let's say we have a bit of a looser term of or a looser definition of the action goal, and the fact that you're taking a route to go home, then having a red light in that route could be more of an environmental constraint. So usually when I give you guys like observations or whatever in class, or well, in your activities since we're not in class, usually I kind of leave it up to your interpretation and how you define your task and environmental constraints. You just have to be a little bit more specific with your wording. So that way it's very clear that environmental constraints are not specific to the task and that task constraints are specific to the task. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of constraints is atypical development. So atypical development is going to be classified as either advanced or delayed, right? So atypical just meaning not the norm. So somebody develops faster than others, somebody develops slower. But these are advanced or delayed developmental milestones based on the average or typical motor development. The primary focus is usually on delayed development, because if somebody's not progressing at a certain rate, we usually have a question like, I wonder why, what's going wrong? So typically people who have delayed development are going to be people with certain types of motor disabilities. Motor disabilities could include neurological problems, abnormally slowed or accelerated physical development. So there's a wide array of things that could kind of contribute to delayed development. But usually that's the one we focus on because we want people to develop in the age-related sequence that they should, in terms of what typical is. Atypical developmental constraints can also include cognitive impairments that specifically overflow into stunted motor development. So if you have a child who has like mental retardation, right, and they have a learning disability and don't pick up motor skills as fast, they're going to have a delayed onset of certain motor milestones as a result of their psychological status, okay, or how they process information. So that concludes our section on constraints. The last section that we have is going to be focused on motor development and research.